The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as 12-year-old Tommy Chen walked home from school, his backpack heavy with math homework he wasn't looking forward to. The local grocery store's bright signs caught his eye, reminding him that he had $5 in his pocket, just enough for his favorite chocolate milk and maybe a small bag of chips. As he approached the store's entrance, something made him pause. Near the bicycle rack, an elderly man in a worn brown sweater was standing completely still, looking around with confusion written all over his face. What caught Tommy's attention wasn't just that the man seemed lost, but how other people kept walking past him, some even crossing to the other side of the street to avoid him. The old man's sweater had little balls of loose thread, and his gray hair was slightly messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it over and over. He kept checking his pockets, pulling out a handkerchief, then putting it back, only to check again a few seconds later. Tommy noticed his hands were shaking. A young couple walked past, whispering to each other and throwing concerned glances at the man. A store employee peeked out the door but quickly went back inside. Tommy thought about his own grandfather, who lived far away in California. The thought of him being alone and confused like this made Tommy's chest feel tight. Taking a deep breath, Tommy walked closer. "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle like his mom had taught him when talking to elderly people. The man turned to Tommy, relief flooding his face at being acknowledged. His eyes were a bright blue, reminding Tommy of the sky on clear days. I seem to be a bit turned around," he said, his voice carrying the kind of wisdom that comes with age, even though his words were uncertain. "I was just getting some bread for Martha. Or was it milk?" Tommy noticed a small grocery list poking out of the man's pocket, the paper crumpled from being handled too much. The man, who would later introduce himself as Mr. Harrison, kept looking around at the buildings as if they were strangers he was trying to recognize. "My house. It's somewhere here. I've lived there for 40 years, you see," Mr. Harrison said, his voice cracking slightly. "But today, everything looks different. The streets have changed." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Or maybe I've changed." The way he said those last words made Tommy forget all about his chocolate milk craving. He could see fear behind Mr. Harrison's friendly smile, the kind of fear you feel when the whole world suddenly stops making sense. Other people kept streaming past them, lost in their own busy lives, their phones, their conversations. But Tommy stayed put, feeling in his heart that this moment was more important than rushing home to watch his favorite YouTube videos or even finishing his math homework. Little did Tommy know that this simple decision to stop and help would not only change Mr. Harrison's life, but would ripple out to transform their entire community. As he stood there on that ordinary Wednesday afternoon, he was about to learn that sometimes the biggest adventures don't start with a bang or a dramatic moment, but with a quiet choice to be kind when nobody else is watching. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic, but right there, in front of Mike's grocery store, time seemed to slow down as 12-year-old Tommy Chen made a choice that would lead to an extraordinary chain of events, all starting with 7 simple words. "Can I help you find your way?" When Mr. Harrison heard Tommy's offer to help, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if someone had lifted a heavy weight off them. He patted his pockets again, this time pulling out a half-empty pack of mint gum. "Would you like some?" he asked, his hands trembling as he held it out. Tommy accepted a piece, noticing how this small act of sharing seemed to help the old man feel more in control. "I used to give gum to my students," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes brightening for a moment. "They weren't supposed to chew it in class, but sometimes, during long lectures." He chuckled, then suddenly looked confused again, as if the memory had slipped away like water through his fingers. Tommy sat down with Mr. Harrison on a nearby bench, the metal cold through his school pants. He pulled out his own after-school snack, a slightly squished peanut butter sandwich his mom had packed that morning. Breaking it in half, he offered a piece to Mr. Harrison, who accepted it with a grateful smile. My wife Martha makes the best peanut butter cookies, Mr. Harrison said, taking small, careful bites. She puts little chocolate chips in them. Or was it butterscotch? His forehead wrinkled with effort as he tried to remember. Tommy noticed how Mr. Harrison's eyes kept scanning the street, like someone searching for familiar faces in a crowd of strangers. As they shared the simple meal, Mr. Harrison began telling stories from his teaching days. His words came out jumbled at first, like puzzle pieces from different boxes, but Tommy listened patiently. He learned that Mr. Harrison had taught at a university, something about the human brain and how memories work, which seems sadly ironic now. The fascinating thing about memories, Mr. Harrison said, suddenly sounding more like a professor than a lost elderly man, is how they connect to emotions. I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember the day I met Martha like it was yesterday. She was wearing a yellow dress, and there were roses. Tommy perked up at this detail. Roses? Like the ones in the garden of that blue house near the library? He asked, remembering the beautiful flower bed he passed on his way to school. Mr. Harrison's eyes lit up with recognition. Yes, Martha's roses. She tends them every morning, wearing her big straw hat. His voice became stronger, more certain. This small connection seemed to ground him, like finding a familiar star in a confusing sky. A cool breeze ruffled through the trees, carrying the smell of someone's fireplace nearby. Tommy pulled his jacket closer and noticed Mr. Harrison shivering slightly in his thin sweater. Without saying anything, Tommy dug through his backpack and pulled out his spare gym sweatshirt. It was too small for Mr. Harrison, but the old man held it gratefully in his lap, like a comfort blanket. They sat there as the afternoon light grew softer, Mr. Harrison sharing fragments of stories, some clear as day, others fading like old photographs. He told Tommy about teaching students from all over the world, about the time he almost won a big science prize, and about how he met Martha at a coffee shop when he accidentally took her cappuccino instead of his black coffee. Tommy noticed how Mr. Harrison became more animated when talking about the past, his hands moving expressively, his voice growing stronger. But whenever the conversation drifted to the present, especially about where he lived, that lost look would return to his eyes. As the shadows grew longer and the after-work crowd began filling the sidewalks, Tommy made a decision. He wasn't going to just call for help and leave Mr. Harrison with strangers. Something about the way the old professor talked about Martha's roses gave Tommy an idea of where his home might be. Besides, his mom always said that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the quickest or easiest thing. Gathering their things, Tommy stood up and held out his hand to Mr. Harrison. Sir, I think I might know where your house is. Would you like me to walk with you? You can tell me more about your teaching days on the way. The smile that spread across Mr. Harrison's face was worth every minute of the homework time Tommy was giving up. Sometimes, he realized, the most important lessons happen outside of school. Finding Mr. Harrison's house turned into a detective game that Tommy hadn't expected to play that afternoon. As they walked down Oak Street, Tommy kept his eyes peeled for clues, remembering bits and pieces from Mr. Harrison's stories. The old professor had mentioned roses, a blue house, and something about being able to hear the library clock chiming every hour. Look, Mr. Harrison, Tommy said, pointing to a street sign. Does Maple Avenue look familiar? The old man squinted at the green sign, shaking his head slowly. But when they passed the old bookstore with its red brick walls, Mr. Harrison suddenly stopped. I buy Martha's birthday cards there, he said softly, touching the store window. The lady inside, she always wraps them in purple paper because... He paused, frustrated. Because there was something special about purple. Tommy made a mental note. The bookstore was just 3 blocks from the Victorian house with the rose garden he'd been thinking of. Sir, did Mrs. Harrison like getting her cards wrapped in purple because it matched the flowers in your garden? He asked carefully. Mr. Harrison's face brightened. Yes, the purple clematis. It climbs up the porch rails. Martha planted it the year we moved in. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. As they walked, Tommy noticed how Mr. Harrison would sometimes grip his arm tightly when cars passed by, as if the normal street noise was suddenly too overwhelming. During these moments, Tommy would slow down and point out quiet things. A squirrel gathering acorns, a wind chime tinkling in someone's yard, a cat watching them from a windowsill. These small distractions seemed to help calm Mr. Harrison's nerves. The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting everything in warm golden light. Tommy's legs were getting tired, but he kept going, encouraged by how Mr. Harrison seemed to recognize more things as they got closer to the library area. The old man's stories became clearer too, less jumbled. "I used to take my morning coffee on the porch," Mr. Harrison said, his voice stronger now. "Every day at 7, just as the library clock would chime. Martha would be in her garden, and the birds—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Tommy followed his gaze and saw it. The beautiful blue Victorian house he passed so many times on his way to school. The garden was exactly as he remembered, filled with late-blooming roses, and just as Mr. Harrison had said, purple clematis climbing up the porch rails. The library clock tower peeked over the treetops behind it. But something was different today. The garden, usually so neat and tidy, looked slightly untended, as if someone had been too worried to care for it. Some tools lay scattered on the lawn, and the porch light was on even though it wasn't dark yet. Signs that someone had left in a hurry. Tommy's heart beat faster. This had to be it. All the clues fit. The blue house, the roses, the library clock, the purple clematis. He watched Mr. Harrison's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition. The old professor stood very still, staring at the house. His hand trembled as he pointed to a window on the second floor. "My study," he whispered. "The window with the green shutters. That's where I—" Tears began forming in his eyes. "That's where I grade papers. Use to grade papers. Sometimes Martha brings me tea and—" Before Tommy could respond, a sound caught their attention. The library clock began to chime, its deep, familiar tones rolling across the neighborhood. Mr. Harrison closed his eyes, listening. With each chime, he seemed to stand a little straighter, as if the sound was pulling him back to himself. 5 o'clock, he said clearly. "Martha will be worried. She always worries when I'm late for tea." For the first time since Tommy had met him, Mr. Harrison sounded completely certain about something. Tommy felt a wave of relief wash over him. After all their walking, all the clues and stories, they had finally found home. What he didn't know yet was that their journey wasn't quite over, and the biggest surprise was waiting just behind that blue door with its brass knocker, where someone had been watching anxiously for hours, praying for her husband's safe return. The walk to Mr. Harrison's house had taken much longer than Tommy expected. His arms ached from carrying the grocery bags they'd picked up along the way. Mr. Harrison had remembered he was supposed to buy bread and milk, so they'd stopped at a corner store. The plastic handles dug into Tommy's fingers, but he didn't complain. Every time he felt tired, he thought of his own grandfather and kept going. Mr. Harrison walked slowly beside him, stopping every few steps to catch his breath. The old professor would use these moments to share more stories about his life, each one becoming clearer as they got closer to home. It was like watching an old television getting better reception with each step they took. "You know," Mr. Harrison said during one of their breaks, sitting on a low garden wall, "I taught for 43 years. The human brain was my specialty." He tapped his temple with a finger. "Ironic, isn't it? Now my own brain plays tricks on me." His voice carried no bitterness, just a gentle acceptance that made Tommy's heart squeeze. As they rested, Mr. Harrison pulled out an old leather wallet, showing Tommy a faded photograph of a younger version of himself standing in front of a university building. "I used to give lectures about memory," he said, his voice growing stronger as he recalled his teaching days. Hundreds of students would come. Some of them are doctors now, helping people like me. Tommy listened intently, amazed at how Mr. Harrison could remember complex details about neuroscience but couldn't recall his own address. The old professor explained how memories work, using simple words that Tommy could understand. "It's like a library where all the books keep changing shelves," he said with a small laugh. "Sometimes you know exactly what book you want, but you just can't find it." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they continued their journey. Tommy noticed how Mr. Harrison would brighten up whenever they passed something familiar: the old oak tree with a crooked branch, the house with the red door, the corner where the crossing guard stood during school hours. "I used to walk this route every day," Mr. Harrison said, his pace picking up slightly. "Martha would pack my lunch in a brown paper bag, just like your mother did with your sandwich." He smiled at the memory. She never forgot to include a napkin with a little note written on it. As they walked, Tommy asked questions about history, remembering how clearly Mr. Harrison had spoken about his teaching days. The old professor's eyes lit up as he described events from long ago, explaining things in a way that made Tommy feel like he was watching a movie instead of sitting through a boring history lesson. "Young man," Mr. Harrison said suddenly, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder, "you remind me of my students, the good ones, who asked questions because they really wanted to know the answers." His eyes were clear and focused when he said this, making Tommy stand a little straighter with pride. The grocery bags felt heavier with each step, but Tommy remembered something his mom always said: "Kindness might make your arms tired, but it makes your heart stronger." He shifted the bags from one hand to another, determined to help Mr. Harrison get home safely. They passed the library, its tall clock tower watching over them like a friendly giant. The chimes rang out again, making Mr. Harrison smile. "Martha will have the kettle on," he said confidently. "She always does at this time. Earl Grey tea with a splash of milk, and sometimes those little cookies she keeps in the blue tin." The way he spoke about Martha was different now, clearer, more certain. It was as if the closer they got to home, the stronger his connection to the present became. Tommy noticed how Mr. Harrison's steps were more sure, his shoulders straighter, as if he was slowly finding his way back to himself. The blue Victorian house was just ahead now, its windows glowing with warm light in the fading day. Tommy could see movement behind the curtains, a shadow passing back and forth. Someone was waiting, watching, hoping. His tired arms and legs suddenly felt lighter. They were almost there, and something told him that the end of this journey would be worth every step. As Tommy and Mr. Harrison approached the blue Victorian house, the front door burst open. There, on the porch, stood a small woman wearing a gardening apron, her silver hair escaping from what had probably been a neat bun hours ago. Her hands flew to her mouth when she saw them. "Robert," she cried out, nearly tripping down the porch steps in her rush to reach her husband. This was Martha, and the worry of hours showed on her face. Her eyes were red from crying, and she held a phone in her trembling hand. She'd probably been calling everyone she could think of. Tommy stood back a little, still holding the grocery bags, as Martha threw her arms around Mr. Harrison. "Where have you been? I've been so worried. I called the police, the neighbors, everyone." Her voice cracked with emotion as she held her husband's face between her hands, checking if he was okay. Mr. Harrison looked at his wife with pure recognition, the clearest his eyes had been all afternoon. "Martha, my dear," he said softly, "I went to get milk and bread." He gestured toward Tommy and the grocery bags. "This young man helped me find my way home." Martha turned to Tommy, really seeing him for the first time. Her eyes welled up with fresh tears, but these were different from the worried ones she'd been crying before. "You brought him home," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "You brought him home to me." Before Tommy could say anything, Martha had wrapped him in a hug too, grocery bags and all. She smelled like cinnamon and garden flowers, reminding him of his own grandmother. "Come inside, both of you," she insisted, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. "The kettle's been on for hours. I kept hoping." Inside, the house was warm and cozy, filled with old books and comfortable furniture. Pictures covered the walls, younger versions of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison smiling at their wedding, standing in front of famous buildings, surrounded by groups of students. Tommy noticed how many of the photos showed Mr. Harrison in front of classrooms or receiving awards. Martha busied herself in the kitchen while Mr. Harrison settled into what was clearly his favorite armchair, looking more relaxed than he had all afternoon. "This is where I read my morning paper," he said confidently, patting the worn armrest. The confusion that had clouded his face earlier was almost gone now that he was in familiar surroundings. "It's getting worse," Martha said quietly to Tommy as she poured tea in the kitchen. Her hands shook slightly as she arranged cookies on a plate. They were indeed kept in a blue tin, just as Mr. Harrison had remembered. "This is the first time he's wandered away. I only left him alone for 20 minutes while I ran to check the mail." She had to stop and take a deep breath. The doctors said this might happen, but knowing it might happen and living through it are two very different things. She looked at Tommy with eyes full of emotion. "Do you know what could have happened if you hadn't helped him? If you hadn't been so patient? If you just walked past like everyone else did?" Tommy helped her carry the tea tray to the living room, where Mr. Harrison was happily looking through a photo album he'd found. "Martha, look," he called out excitedly. "Here's the picture from when I won the teaching award. Remember how nervous I was during my speech?" Martha's face lit up at his clear memory. "You were so nervous you put your tie on backward," she laughed, sitting beside him. She poured 3 cups of tea, Earl Grey with a splash of milk, exactly as Mr. Harrison had predicted. The cookies were homemade, still soft in the middle. As they sat together in the warm living room, sharing tea and cookies, Tommy noticed how the Harrisons kept looking at each other, having entire conversations without words. Every time Mr. Harrison remembered something clearly, Martha's eyes would sparkle with joy. And when he got confused about small details, she'd gently help him find the right memory, like someone helping to untangle a knotted thread. What Tommy didn't know yet was that this peaceful scene was just the beginning. The Harrisons had a surprise coming for him, one that would change his life forever. But for now, he was content simply sitting there, dunking his cookie in his tea, watching 2 people who had loved each other for over 50 years find their way back to each other after a frightening day. As they finished their tea, Martha excused herself for a moment and returned with a leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. "Tommy, would you like to see something special?" she asked, sitting down next to her husband. Mr. Harrison perked up, recognizing the book immediately. "Ah, our achievements album," he said proudly, his voice strong and clear. Martha opened the book carefully, and Tommy's eyes widened. Inside were newspaper clippings, certificates, and photographs that told the story of an extraordinary life he never would have guessed at when he first met the confused elderly man outside the grocery store. "You see, Tommy," Martha explained, turning the pages gently. Before Robert's illness, he was one of the country's leading experts in brain science. "This article here, it's about the research center he helped build at the university." She pointed to a yellowed newspaper clipping showing a younger Mr. Harrison cutting a ribbon in front of a large building. Tommy leaned closer, fascinated. The article described how Mr. Harrison had donated millions of dollars to build a center dedicated to studying memory diseases. There were photos of him shaking hands with important people, receiving awards, and speaking at large conferences. "We've been fortunate in life," Martha continued, her voice soft. "Robert's research led to several important discoveries. When companies wanted to use his findings, they paid well for the rights." She squeezed her husband's hand. "We never cared much about the money ourselves, but we knew it could help others." Mr. Harrison, who had been quietly looking at the photos, suddenly spoke up. "The irony doesn't escape me," he said with a gentle smile. "I spent my life studying memory loss, and now—" he tapped his temple. "Now I'm experiencing it firsthand. But you know what's remarkable?" He looked at Tommy. "Even when I couldn't remember my address today, I never forgot how to be grateful for kindness." Martha wiped a tear from her eye and turned another page. This one showed photographs of a new wing being added to the local hospital, the Harrison Memory Care Center. "We've been funding research for years," she explained, "trying to help families dealing with Alzheimer's and other memory conditions. But today taught us something that all our money and research hadn't shown us." She looked at Tommy with warm eyes. "Sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't in a pill bottle or a research lab. Sometimes it's in a simple act of kindness from a young boy who chooses to stop and help when others walk by." Tommy felt his cheeks grow warm at the praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he said quietly, but Martha shook her head. "But that's just it, dear. Not everyone did. We heard from the store clerk later. He saw Robert standing there confused, but just went back inside. Several people crossed the street to avoid him. But you—" She reached out and patted his hand. "You gave up your whole afternoon to help a stranger find his way home." Mr. Harrison, who had been flipping through more pages of the album, suddenly looked up with perfect clarity. "Martha," he said, "remember what we were discussing last week? About wanting to make a different kind of contribution to the community." Martha's eyes lit up. "Yes, of course." She turned to Tommy with excitement in her voice. "You see, we've been thinking about how to help young people who show real compassion and understanding toward elderly people with memory problems. After all, they're the future caregivers, doctors, and researchers who might someday find a cure." Tommy listened politely, not quite understanding where this conversation was going. He was just happy to have helped Mr. Harrison get home safely. He glanced at the clock, realizing his own mom might be getting worried. What he didn't know was that in Martha's desk upstairs lay a document that would change his life. A decision the Harrisons had made in those quiet moments while Tommy was helping them prepare the tea. But for now, Martha simply smiled mysteriously and began gathering the empty teacups, leaving Tommy to wonder about the meaningful looks the elderly couple kept exchanging. The next morning started like any other day for Tommy. He woke up early, had breakfast with his parents, and grabbed his backpack for school. His mom was making lunch in the kitchen when they heard the mail slot click. "That's odd," his mom said, checking her watch. "The mail never comes this early." She walked to the front door and picked up a single cream-colored envelope. Her eyes widened as she read the return address. "Tommy, honey, this is from the Harrison estate." Tommy nearly dropped his cereal spoon. He hadn't told his parents about yesterday's adventure yet. He'd gotten home late, and they'd been too busy asking where he'd been to hear the full story. Now, holding the fancy envelope, his mom looked at him with curious eyes. "Is there something you want to tell us about yesterday?" she asked, sitting down at the kitchen table. Tommy took a deep breath and told them everything. About meeting Mr. Harrison, their long walk home, the tea with Martha, and learning about their work with memory research. His dad had stopped getting ready for work and sat down too, listening intently. When Tommy finished his story, his mom had tears in her eyes. "That explains this letter," she said softly, carefully opening the envelope. As she read, her hands started shaking. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "Oh my, Tommy." She passed the letter to his dad, who let out a low whistle as he read it. "Son," his dad said, his voice unusually quiet, "the Harrisons have set up a college scholarship fund in your name. Full tuition to any university you choose when you're ready." He paused, reading further. "They write here that your kindness yesterday showed them that sometimes the best investment isn't in research labs, but in people who have natural compassion." Tommy sat there, stunned. He thought about Mr. Harrison's confused face yesterday, about Martha's worried eyes, about their worn kitchen and the photo album full of achievements. He hadn't helped them expecting anything in return. He'd just done what felt right. His mom was crying now, happy tears rolling down her cheeks. "There's more," she said, reading the letter again. "They're starting a new program at their memory care center, inspired by you. They're calling it the Young Companions Initiative. It will pair high school students with elderly residents who need friendship and support." Tommy's dad reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "We're so proud of you, son. Not because of the scholarship, though that's incredible, but because you showed real character yesterday. You didn't know Mr. Harrison was wealthy or important. You just saw someone who needed help." The kitchen filled with morning sunlight as they sat there together, the letter on the table between them. Tommy thought about how his simple decision to stop and help had turned into something so much bigger than himself. His mom wiped her eyes and looked at the clock. "You'll be late for school," she said, but her voice was full of pride. As Tommy grabbed his backpack, she hugged him tight. "You know what makes this extra special?" she asked. "The Harrisons didn't just write a check. They're using what happened to help other people too. That's how real change happens. One kind act leads to another." Walking to school that morning, Tommy felt different. Not because of the scholarship, though that was amazing. No, it was because he understood something new about kindness. Sometimes a simple choice, like stopping to help an elderly man find his way home, could start a chain reaction of good things that nobody could have predicted. He passed the blue Victorian house on his way. Martha was in the garden, wearing her big straw hat, tending to her roses. Mr. Harrison sat in a rocking chair on the porch, reading his morning paper, exactly where he'd said he liked to sit. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. You'd never guess that just yesterday. Things had been so different. Martha waved when she saw him, her face breaking into a warm smile. "See you on Sunday," she called out. They'd invited Tommy to visit every week to spend time with Mr. Harrison. Tommy waved back, grinning. He had a feeling these Sunday visits would become one of the best parts of his life. News of the Harrisons' gift to Tommy spread through the community like a gentle ripple in a pond. It wasn't just about the scholarship. It was the story behind it that touched people's hearts. The local newspaper ran a small article about the Young Companions Initiative, and soon something remarkable started happening in their quiet town. At the high school, the guidance counselor's office began filling up with students wanting to volunteer. "I saw my grandpa struggle with memory problems last year," one girl told Tommy during lunch. "I never thought I could do anything to help, but now I know I can." The program started small. Just 10 students paired with elderly residents who needed companionship. Tommy helped Martha organize the first meeting at the Harrison Memory Care Center. He watched as nervous teenagers and uncertain seniors slowly began talking, sharing stories, and finding common ground despite their age difference. Mr. Harrison had good days and not so good days, but he never missed these gatherings. On good days, he would share his knowledge with the young volunteers, teaching them about memory and the brain in ways that made complex science feel like fascinating stories. Even on his confused days, he showed everyone how to face challenges with grace and humor. "You see," he told the group one afternoon, "memory is like a library where the lights keep flickering. Sometimes it's bright and clear, and sometimes it's dark. But the books are always there. We just need help finding them sometimes." The teenagers nodded, understanding the metaphor in a way no textbook could have taught them. Martha started a weekly tea circle where volunteers and seniors would gather to share cookies and conversations. The kitchen would fill with laughter as young people learned to play old card games, and elderly residents learned about modern music and technology. Sometimes, the simplest things brought the most joy, like when one of the seniors remembered a volunteer's name without prompting, or when a shy teenager finally got their elderly companion to smile. Tommy's friend Pete, who usually spent all his free time playing video games, started visiting Mr. Chen, an elderly man who loved chess. "It's weird," Pete said one day, but I actually look forward to our games more than my online ones now. Mr. Chen tells the best stories when he's moving his pieces. The local coffee shop started offering free hot chocolate to any volunteer wearing their young companion's badge. The owner, whose mother had struggled with memory loss, said it was his way of supporting what the kids were doing. Soon other businesses joined in. The bookstore offered discounts on large print books, and the ice cream parlor hosted monthly social gatherings. One day, while helping Martha in her garden, Tommy found himself teaching another volunteer how to approach someone who seemed confused. The most important thing, he explained, recalling his first meeting with Mr. Harrison, is to make them feel safe and heard. Don't rush them. Sometimes they just need someone to listen while they find their way back to themselves. The program's success caught the attention of nearby towns. Other communities started reaching out, wanting to know how they could start similar initiatives. Martha received calls from memory care centers in different cities, all asking how to connect young people with elderly residents who needed support. What touched Tommy the most wasn't the recognition or the way adults now treated him with newfound respect. It was the small moments, like when Mrs. Parker, one of the elderly participants, remembered his birthday even though she often forgot her own daughter's name. Or when shy Kevin from his math class found his voice while reading stories to a group of seniors who hung on his every word. During one of their Sunday visits, Tommy sat with Mr. Harrison in his favorite porch spot. The old professor was having a clear day, and he looked out at the garden where several volunteer teenagers were helping Martha with her roses. "You know, Tommy," he said thoughtfully, "when I was doing research, I always hoped to leave a legacy that would help people with memory problems. I never imagined that my own struggle would lead to something like this." He gestured to the young people in the garden. Sometimes the best medicines aren't the ones we find in laboratories. Sometimes they're the ones we find in human hearts. 3 months had passed since that fateful afternoon when Tommy first met Mr. Harrison outside the grocery store. The seasons had changed, turning the leaves golden and filling the air with autumn crispness. But the real changes in their community ran much deeper than the weather. Every Sunday afternoon, like clockwork, Tommy would ring the doorbell of the blue Victorian house. Martha always answered with a warm smile and the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. Mr. Harrison would be in his favorite chair, sometimes clear and chatty, other times quiet and confused, but always happy to see his young friend. On this particular Sunday, Tommy arrived to find something special happening. The living room was filled with people from the Young Companions program. Both volunteers and seniors gathered for a small celebration. Martha had arranged photos on a display board, showing the program's growth over the past 3 months. "Look at this," she said proudly, pointing to a picture of Mr. Harrison, teaching a group of teenagers about the brain using a model he kept from his professor days. He may not remember what he had for breakfast, but when he starts explaining neuroscience, it all comes flooding back. The students love it. They say he makes it easier to understand than their textbooks. The most remarkable thing wasn't just the program's success. It was how it had changed everyone involved. Mrs. Liu, who rarely spoke to anyone 3 months ago, was now teaching young volunteers how to make paper cranes. Mr. Peterson, a former music teacher who'd stopped playing due to his memory problems, had started giving piano lessons again with a teenage helper by his side. Tommy watched as Lisa, one of the shyest girls in his class, confidently helped an elderly woman with a jigsaw puzzle. 3 months ago, Lisa barely spoke above a whisper. Now here she was, gently guiding confused hands toward the right puzzle pieces, chatting and laughing like she'd been doing it all her life. "You know what the doctors told me last week?" Martha said quietly to Tommy as they watched the scene. "They say Robert's condition hasn't gotten worse since the program started. Usually, it progresses faster. They think all this interaction, all this positive energy, it's helping him stay connected to the present." Mr. Harrison, sitting in his usual spot, called Tommy over. Today was one of his good days. "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes clear and focused, "about what happened that day you found me. I was so lost, not just physically, but in my mind. Everything was foggy, scary. But you—" He paused, squeezing Tommy's hand. "You didn't just help me find my way home. You helped me find my purpose again." Martha joined them, bringing tea in the familiar cups. "Before all this," she explained, "we thought we could only help through research and donations. But look around this room." She gestured to the pairs of young and old people scattered throughout the house, each engaged in their own activities. Money can't buy this kind of connection. The scholarship money still sat untouched in a trust fund for Tommy's future education. But the real reward had been something nobody could have predicted. The way his simple act of kindness had sparked a movement that was changing lives daily. A new visitor center was being built at the Harrison Memory Care Center, specifically designed for the Young Companions program. Other cities were starting to copy their model. But more importantly, people in their community had started looking at each other differently. Elderly people with memory problems weren't seen as someone to avoid anymore. They were neighbors with stories to share, wisdom to give, and love to offer. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting warm shadows across the living room full of people, Tommy realized something profound. That confused elderly man he met outside the grocery store hadn't just been lost. He'd been a messenger of sorts, showing everyone that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to help someone else find their way. Mr. Harrison might not remember every detail of that first day anymore, but the impact of what happened lived on in every young volunteer who now stopped to help a confused senior, in every elderly person who felt less alone, and in every connection that turned strangers into friends. In the end, it wasn't just about finding the way home. It was about creating a new kind of home, one where nobody had to feel lost or forgotten ever again.